Hey there, welcome back to a new episode of Leadership Lanes. Today we have a very special guest with us, Roshan Kulkarni, and he'll be talking about scaling a technology consulting startup. This is the first episode in the startup series of Leadership Lanes, and Roshan is the founder and CEO of Mindstix Software Labs, a technology consulting startup based in US and India. He's also an IT alumnus and brings decades of experience in effectively running and scaling a technology consulting startup. I've worked with Roshan quite a few years and I've considered him my guru. So it feels weird, Roshan, to sit on this side of the table and ask you questions. So welcome to the podcast.
Vijit, pleasure to be here and thank you for having me. Certainly humbled to hear that. So,
To start with, right? And I feel the key to any consulting or tech consulting startup is biz dev. And it all ties down to client acquisition and relationship building. So give me a few thoughts on what you think about how to effectively start and scale biz dev in a technology consulting startup.
yeah, I think that's a great question to kick it off with. Before we go talk about tactics and whatnot, and there is probably a ton of things that one can do in that pathway. I think it really starts off with a level of a mindset, right? That frames your approach eventually. One being that don't be afraid to start small. Don't be afraid to experiment with ideas as well. The second facet of the mindset, I'd say, is this notion that who is your ultimate buyer? And I think many of us get enamored by this notion that your buyer is a $1 billion corporation. They're massive. They probably have big teams that are involved in the decision making process and whatnot. But we often forget the fact that the ultimate buyer is is a human being. And unless we find a way to resonate with somebody at an individual level, right, no amount of messaging and posturing and content is going to help unless it gets to the root of what that person is intending in the relationship, right? And unless we understand either a challenge that they're looking to solve by working with you, or you understand the opportunity that they are looking to unlock by working with you, right? So I think that's the second facet of mindset, I'd say. The third one being, are you truly a credible subject matter expert? Especially, when you're starting off as a very young consulting company in the engineering space, the subject matter expertise that you bring to the table individually, right, as an individual founder often, that bears a significant weight to the ability to open doors at some point. So it's almost like, as a founder, you cannot outsource or delegate this, at least in the early, sort of phase or stages of your company. So those are maybe just some initial thoughts, I have in terms of how do you frame the business development approach here. I think one of your other talks has touched upon the idea of storytelling. And again, I mean, certainly a lot of emphasis on not just having the subject matter expertise, but being able to relate to your audience or to your decision maker. And again, here it's not about the theatrics of storytelling. It's not really so much about that, but the level of conviction, the level of credible authority that you can bring to the subject matter that often opens doors with prospect customers here.
That's an interesting take and something to follow up on that. And that was my follow-up question as well. And typically I've seen, and this is my personal experience of hiring some biz dev employees, it didn't work for me, to be honest. And you yourself answered in that question that human touch, at least in the initial stages of you being the founder and you conveying that personal human touch with your eventual buyer, that is more important than opposed to like having someone hire and do biz dev for you, which typically did not work for me, at least in my earlier days.
Yeah, I think somewhat of a similar experience, I'd say, Abhijit. One of the things that has worked for us, though, is so first of all, right, as a early stage venture, nobody can tell the story of the business and the value you create better than you as a founder or your founding team. The second being that I think we've often looked for such talent inside the house than necessarily saying, hey, let's go out and hire somebody on the biz dev side. And what has helped us there is this could be somebody who is in the weeds of the business, right? Who knows the ins and outs of what is the value that you're creating for the customer. And then grooming somebody like that, elevating somebody like that into your more outward facing sort of business development, customer relationship team. So that is a model that's actually worked exceptionally well for us.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Roshan, on this. Coming to my next question, and this is again a tricky one because I know you started solo, at least in the initial days, and there is always a debate going on whether to go solo or whether to have a co-founder. I have my opinions on that because I typically feel having a co-founder eases the pressure off you a bit. What is your take on going solo or versus having a co-founder at the very start, like say from day one or day 30, for example?
That's a great question, Abhijit. And I think it's also a big dilemma, I suppose, that any aspiring founder or anybody who's passionate about solving a problem, right, for the industry faces. Now, I'll come to a bit on my opinion of things. Interestingly enough, not only has this topic been hotly debated on Reddit and places like that, there's also a fair bit of empirical evidence around this. Okay. And the evidence is somewhat contrarian to my own experience. So I'd rather look at what is statistically significant in trying to answer this, right? I think not too far from you at UPenn, Wharton did a study around whether solo ventures or ventures having multiple co-founders, right? Which one of them is more effective? And they looked at a bunch of parameters. I mean, you look at, hey, what's the survival rate of these companies? What is the longevity of these companies, over the years? Between these two, right? Which companies seem to be better in terms of revenue uptake and so on, right? And one of the things that they found, and when I first read it, I was stunned, was that ventures with solo founders seem to have almost 2x the success rate, more than 2x, something like 2.5, compared to ventures that had multiple co-founders. It's a little hard to, sort of reason why, this seems to be the case. So again, right, on the other hand, you see VCs often talk about dream teams that they want to invest in and so on, and where the implication is there is a bunch of founders who are either complementing skills with each other and so on. So I think to me, there's two ways to look at this. And one is at a decision point. One, that are you just trying to be deliberate and so taken over by the notion of trying to absolutely find a co-founder, right? Or is this something that happens in the natural course of things? And in our case, what essentially happened is a year and a half after I incubated the company, there were certainly some peers I was working with who had shown an exceptional level of resilience, who had shown an exceptional level of a risk-taking attitude, a tremendous level of accountability for what they were doing, right, in our business. And so there was absolutely no reason to consider them anything less than co-founders in the company. And so we had a natural progression where, obviously we divested, equity and whatnot, right, to those people who came along in the next 18 to 24 months in the business. And today, about a decade into the business, we see that with full rights, absolutely a well-deserved sort of a notion that their level of contribution is nothing less than a co-founder in the company. So there's a couple of dynamics here to look at.
That's an interesting take, as you said, right? To 1 year into one or a couple of years into the business, you realize because typically when you go to find, like specifically find a co-founder, having the person resonate your passion towards it is very difficult, I feel. And that's where a lot of people miss the bus. To your other point, yes, as you mentioned, the studies are favoring solo co-founders, but again, you mentioned this as well from a VC perspective. I believe they are more comfortable in putting their bet on a team. That also, I believe, is a fact.
Yeah, there has certainly been a perception that, as an investor, you're looking for that dream team to put your coin in with also so there's a couple of other good things that happen with co-founders, right? I mean, ideal situation, great, everything is harmonious in that sense, and rarely happens, but by nature or nurture, people do bring different experiences to the table. Sometimes, although you want the value systems to align between yourself and the co-founders, right, which is one of the most fundamental tenets of trying to work together on a mission, there are differences in opinion and so on. So trying to build consensus can sometimes bear on the early days of the company too, when you are just trying to get stuff done. So you could look at it from both the lens. I mean, a contrarian point to that could be, I've had numerous instances where my co-founders have protected me from hitting my head against the wall, right? Where you probably were blindsided to something, right? In a big critical decision, in a fairly critical decision, and they have given you a perspective that you thought you never could, right? And this sometimes doesn't always happen with employees, because there's a level of hesitation to share and whatnot at times, right? Whereas a co-founder could say it on your face. In fact, that's the kind of co-founders you would want on the team, who don't hesitate to say what is on their mind.
Coming to the next point, and this is something again which I feel is critical, which is marketing and branding. Flashback to the early 2000s, I feel marketing and branding with the lack of platforms available online was not that easy and was a bit expensive. But nowadays, with the platforms like LinkedIn, Instagram, and all coming up, you feel that for a tech consulting startup, it's as important to go on these platforms and increase their visibility when it comes to branding and marketing.
Yeah, so it's interesting on this one. I think I'd heard somebody say this. Was it Ashwath Damodaran? I think he had said something about technology at one point. In the early days of a new technology, it can prove to be a differentiator. But at some point, when everybody has it, it's akin to nobody having it, right? It's become this great leveler, because just as it's open doors and you have access to the entirety of the possible professional network you could on a LinkedIn, your competitors to have the same leverage today. So in a world where I think we're bombarded with content, in a world where there is no dearth of tweet storms and blogs and flurry of LinkedIn posts, uh, I think the differentiator seems to be going back to the basics, the very basics of interpersonal human interaction at this point, right? Are you able to say what you say with a level of authenticity? Are you able to take the time to listen to your prospect, get to the root of the problem they are really trying to solve for, right? I mean, often enough, despite us being fundamentally an engineering and technology company, a lot of instances where we interact with customers don't start by talking about a technology problem, right? They're talking about a certain challenge, and it's often a vague and amorphous challenge in the line of business that they are trying to solve, right? And so, are you able to empathize with the domain of the customer is a big question, right? So you're right that there are tools available at your disposal. Everything from organic traffic that could be driven through your brand site, to paid search engine marketing and whatnot. At the most fundamental level, you started the first question with relationships. I think at the most fundamental level, the overreach of digital and technology and networking has actually led to the human to human relationships being valued a lot more today. So if you're authentic in your engagement with prospects, if you are able to tell them clearly where your strengths lie and equally so where your strengths aren't, I think they can, there is a level of credibility that leads to better conversion, in my opinion, and not just shouting from the rooftops on a plethora of platforms today.
Got it. That certainly makes sense, actually, Roshan. Coming to my next question, and this again is something that I personally faced as well, wherein you have a challenge of building a strong team, especially a strong engineering and a tech team, initially into the first couple of years or even more, for that matter. And what is your take, or what is your recipe, I would say, in order to make or build a strong engineering team ground up? Because I feel that if you don't have a great team in the initial days, it kind of defines how your company growth is.
Yeah, absolutely, Abhijit. There's a couple of things, I could say for context before getting into the root of the question. So, if you look at the nature of the tech industry for the last decade or so, most often companies have been constrained not so much on the demand side of things, but really on the supply side of things. Right? When you're talking about intense creative work, deep engineering work, the ability to handpick that right talent, and not just talent by way of skills, but talent by way of cultural fitment, talent by way of how they approach their approach to work, right? Their level of intensity and diligence that you would wish to see as a founder, right? And the team that you're building. So those have often been the most dominant challenges, I would say, more so than aspects around business development and so on. Now, there's few ways to look at this. Are you purely looking at hiring people for their core skills, which is really, talent in terms of knowing a certain language, platform, framework, architectural skills, design skills, and whatnot? Or are you looking for people who also bring a level of breadth beyond the expertise that they have built in, right? And so we've always tried to strike a balance in that sense. Sometimes also what happens is you find these Avengers or superheroes who are exceptional at what they do, and you know that for a fact, and yet at the same time you find that there's been challenges in integrating within the rest of the team or integrating with a customer. So part of your responsibility as a leader then happens to be, how do you commit to grooming, how do you commit to their growth journey as broader professionals and not just individual contributors or exceptional individual contributors as they may be. So yeah, I think those are some facets that we look at in terms of hiring people and stuff.
There is always a dilemma when there is a rock star in your team. I mean, I believe that's the most difficult person to manage and deal with.
Yeah, that's true in some sense, and I think our journey as leaders, right, we learn, I won't say so much as manage, but help them integrate better into the rest of the ecosystem. There's also this other facet that it is folks like those, that often lead to raising the bar in the team, right? They're like the beacons of what a high standard means in the team as well. So it's not just about, hey, can you tolerate an outlier genius like that, but how do you get the team to look at a caliber of talent in a very positive way, right? And not just purely comparatively speaking as a perspective.
Yeah, that's an interesting take, actually. Something to learn for me as well on this. One question, maybe this is out of context before I go to the last question, is the initial stages of the company, initial few years. What is your take on organic versus inorganic growth in terms of biz dev?
If you look at the nature of consulting services, creative services, right, deep engineering services kind of companies, yes, in some sense, you're constrained by the caliber and the amount of talent that you can bring to initiatives that you aspire for. And so, in some sense, it is, one could say that there is a very strong organic element to being able to do things. At the same time, I mean, if you cut the clutter and look at the fundamental nature of the business, what are you doing, right? You're either trading your time individually for revenue, or you're trading your team's time for revenue, right? Which is also another factor where you could say, hey, this drives the organic nature of things. But then what happened is, over the years, we realized that there is an opportunity to bring repeatability to solutions, right? You could look at having solved a problem for one customer and then solving adjacent problems for the same customer or customers in a similar segment. At one point, you also, if you question that fundamental nature of trading time for revenue, and if there is an appetite for risk, one of the things we started to do about 4 years into the business is we started to work with customers in an outcome-led kind of a model, right? Where the size of the opportunity is really based on the value we bring in the end, and the risk often is for us to bear. So you're also transferring the risk from the customer to you as a service provider, and so no longer are your outcomes measured merely by number of people and hours and whatnot, but really by the kind of value you could bring to the table from the customer's lens. The next stage that I kind of saw, a few years later into the business was our ability to also bring accelerators to the table, right? So are you really trying to solve every problem from the ground up, every engineering problem solution from the ground up, or are you enabling some, your customers with some accelerators that could help them go faster? So those are some, I'd say, non-linear ways to look at this. And we've certainly had a trajectory which sort of started with organic initially, but then we could see that the curve was, the slope was getting steeper over time.
Got it. Got it. Makes sense. Moving on to my last question, and typically this is a dilemma for every co-founder or every founder, is to part away with equity in initial days of the company or initial days of the startup. And what is your take on that? And how can founders typically get into that mindset of, okay, I need to give away some equity in order to get the talent and the passion that can drive this company forward?
Yeah, I think one could find a lot of prescriptive models and numerical models even around how would you trade off equity and most importantly, what are you trading it off in lieu of, right? Is it because somebody is taking a greater risk in the early stage of the company, right? It's not a proven model yet. I think somebody said this: it's always easy to find the switch after somebody has turned on the light, right? So the harder part is really when the model hasn't proven, right? Things are ambiguous. And so are you really rewarding somebody for being a risk taker at that stage? Or is it the longer journey beyond that, which is really, you're rewarding them in lieu of the efforts put in, right? The toil and the effort put in over the years in the life of a startup. And so that's sort of one variable to look at to decide, your appetite to divest. The second one is, I think often enough, at least what has worked in our case, is when you see somebody in action. And what has also worked in our case is a vesting plan that spans over about a 4 or a 5 year period. And so it's not just equity that's implied by default, but it has to be earned. And again, right, RSUs and things, most companies model structures that way. So a level of an initial cliff and a vesting period of about 3 or 4 years is I've felt is a good model to go. Now, one could also question, is it purely a matter of longevity and time, or can you get into a hybrid model that involves certain outcomes and milestones as well? So people have looked at structuring equity plans that way too. I think
Yeah.
just to add on to it, right, the most fundamental realization you soon enough get is that this cannot be done alone. The journey of start signing up to be a founder or an entrepreneur is not just when you have that initial momentum and moment of inspiration, but it's years of toil and you need a very like-minded and a team that shares your values and your aspirations. So that makes all the difference.
Yeah, that was a great way to end this, actually, Roshan.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for being on the podcast, Roshan. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, Vijay, the pleasure is mine. Yeah, thank you for having me.